our first panel focuses on how universities can help mobilize expertise and partnership in the wake, but also in the preparation for wildfire disasters. The conversation brings together leaders working across environmental health, sustainability, urban planning, and public policy to explore how institutions like UCLA can help connect research, recovery, and long-term resilience, including exploring managed retreat for wildfire. And moderating today's conversation is Cecilia Estolano, CEO and founder of Estolano Advisors. Also has worn many, many hats, so if you don't know her, you should look her up. It's worth a Google. Megan Mullin, faculty director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. Dr. Kari Nadeau, chair of environmental health at Harvard, who we are also pleased to welcome as our incoming dean for UCLA School of Public Health. Nurit Katz, UCLA's Chief Sustainability Officer, and Liz Koslov, Assistant Professor at UCLA's Institute of Environment and Sustainability, and also at the Urban Planning Department in the School of Public Policy. Thank you so much. Let's welcome our next panel.
As the panelists come up, I'm Cecilia Estolano, by the way. As the panelists come up, once a Bruin, always a Bruin. And I just want to note that it's not surprising that this symposium is happening at UCLA. And just the whole theme of this panel is really the essence of what we do here at the greatest public university in the world. So let's get started. Alex set us up so nicely with his three calls to action, right? So we need to design for collision, invest in alignment, and build for action. This panel is a bunch of rock stars in their own realm. It's also not a coincidence that they're all women. It's also not a coincidence that this is about partnership and what does actual collaboration mean. We talk about partnerships all the time, particularly when we're trying to raise money, let's be frank. But the nuts and bolts of actually doing it, and when you do this in the long term and set in motion, that building of trust and maintenance of trust through continuous activity in advance, then when these things occur, we're able to move more quickly. So we're going to get right into it. You've heard about the introduction. Also, go Google these folks because it's truly an honor to be up here as just merely somebody with a master's in urban planning and a lawyer to boot. You know, these people are real experts. So what we're going to ask each panelist to do is spend 3 to 4 minutes, and that's a challenge, talking about the collaborative work that we're featuring. We could do panels on each of their work and could be hours long, and it would be extraordinary. So we're not going to focus on the actual research details, but just on the process and the collaboration that they went through. Just so it's a brief framing, we're going to ask them to spend 3 or 4 minutes on that, and then we're going to get into a series of questions and then have time. We actually want to have a dialogue because this is about collaboration and partnership, which is the give and take between the different roles that people play. And then we want to create some space for some Q&A, and then we'll get off and let you guys get going. But the first thing I actually want to frame this with is, so I'm a practitioner. I am not an academic. I'm always impressed to come to UCLA and be honored to sit on the same stage as people that do this type of research. But the thing is, I'm a planner who graduated from UCLA, what is now the Luskin School, but was the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning. And we were raised as planners in a school of radical planning to be interdisciplinary and to always frame our work in how is it going to affect the community. That's just the way we were trained as planners. So to me, what we're doing here today is about just implementing the type of training and the methodology that was inculcated in those of us who've gone to that terrific school, just a plug for urban planning. So let's start actually with Kari Nadeau. Welcome to UCLA. I know you've been here a lot. It's just delightful to have you coming back. When do you come? When is it? When do we? July 1st. July 1st. So you can stop saying Harvard and say UCLA. Yeah, so Kari did some amazing work around fire health assessments and trying to understand the gaps of what happens when there's an urban wildfire, and what does that do for public health impacts? So maybe you could talk a little bit about your work you've done.
Yeah, and it's really about a we. It's not me, because I really want to emphasize the fact that with all of the work we do, it is truly teamwork. It's interdisciplinary. And for those of you who are affected by the LA fires directly, I am very sorry. And I know that a lot of us were inspired by what happened in the Palisades and as well as Altadena. So I'll just talk quickly about that story, because I had been working in Northern California mostly, and I had also had to evacuate my home about 3 times when I was in Northern California. So when this happened, I personally felt that we wanted to rush to help LA. And what actually happened was 2 weeks after the fire, we get a call from the New York Times. I happened to be in Boston at the time, and I get asked for a comment. And so after that comment was published in the New York Times, one of your wonderful philanthropists here in LA, who lived in the Palisades, who was affected by the fire, his family foundation gave us a call and said to me, "Would you like to stand up a consortium?" And I think he got my name because I was also on something called the National Academies of Medicine. So long story short, I was within about a week after the fires. And so I had met Michael Jarrett already at a previous conference that Jennifer had organized. So again, really connecting the people here. I texted Michael Jarrett. I was asked by the donor to connect up people at UC Davis, UT Austin, UCLA, USC. He wanted to have a consortium to really do the science and the gaps that exist for fires. And I knew in my field that there were a lot of gaps. But in addressing those gaps, we needed to absolutely go to the community. So what happened was within a week, and I know for those of you who've ever tried to put a consortium together within a week, kudos. Many scars later, what happened was we developed community among ourselves. And in that, we had people, place, and purpose. And the people that mattered was the community of LA. The place of LA is incredibly special, 10 million people, and we wanted to understand the wildland-urban interface. The gaps existed for exposures, for chemicals, what exactly was in the soil, air, water, and debris in the acute as well as the long-term consequences of the LA fires. And then not just exposures, but also health outcomes. No one really knew the acute and long-term health outcomes after fires. So we got together, 10 universities, focused on the people of LA, focused on our common purpose. And I think it was through that that we got through a lot of rough times, a lot of smooth times, and now we're at the point where we share our data and move the needle forward directly to impact communities.
Thanks so much for that. I want to bring up now, ask Nurit Katz, who really plays a very different role as the Chief Sustainability Officer here at UCLA, but also as a Los Angeles Department of Water and Power Commissioner. So Nurit is just like by nature is the bridge to so many of the communities and trying to get academia to bridge to action. Nurit, tell us a little bit about the work that you just started to pull together, and then suddenly it became like the hottest thing, Defensible Space and Wildfire Resilience Working Group, which I'm sure is it's just gotten recent attention in the last couple of days with the new Zone 0 regulations coming out and some debates about that. So
yeah,
please
thank you so much. Really wonderful to have you here and for all of your support of UC as a former regent and all of the hats that you've worn. So I also, like you, am not a wildfire scholar here on the panel. I do research, but it's not on this topic. But I got thrown into all of this because the Board of Forestry was working on a new statewide regulation on Zone 0. If anyone is not familiar here, defensible space is around how do we make our homes safer from wildfire, living with wildfire, how do we prepare our homes? And specifically around the areas surrounding the home. So Zone 0 is the area closest to the home, and there's concern about ember ignition. And so the Board of Forestry was working on a statewide rule to determine what is allowed in that zone. And the initial rules that they put out raised a lot of concern. Specifically around here in Los Angeles and Southern California, happening at the same time as this, there were new very high fire severity zone maps that came out. And now there were all these areas in Southern California that were highly urban that were now in the very high fire severity zone, Silver Lake and Chinatown, and areas that had never had to deal with defensible space at all. These rules that came out initially, to many people, seemed very clearly designed for a conifer forest model, for a home in the middle of a 1 acre property, and not for a dense urban environment. So I was hearing a lot of concerns from colleagues, LA County and LA City and others, and I said, let's have a call. I spoke to maybe 8 people, and I said, let's get together. Feel free to invite others. And so the first call, I think, had 120 or 140 people. It was very unplanned, but it became clear that there was a lot of concerns about these complex intersecting regulations and how they might impact our region, specifically, especially around tree canopy. So here in Los Angeles, Alex set us up very well in terms of thinking about climate adaptation and everything. Well, for us, extreme heat is a big piece of what we deal with here. And the urban forest is a big part of how we combat that, and providing shade, et cetera. And so this initial Zone 0 rule, the way that it set it up in terms of tree requirements, would have resulted in the loss of most tree canopy in Zone 0 in these Los Angeles areas. And so LA County Planning was part of these discussions and developed a map. And it showed that in some neighborhoods like Silver Lake, up to 18% of the tree canopy was in Zone 0, because this is how we plant our trees in Los Angeles, is next to the home for shade. At the same time, there was a huge amount of complexity around the science of vegetation and fire. On an anecdotal level, we were hearing from retired firefighters about hiding behind vegetation because of the ember protective nature of vegetation, while others were very concerned about the ignition potential of vegetation. There have been new studies coming out that show a very complex picture when it comes to trees and when it comes to vegetation. And so a lot of our discussion was focused on policymaking under uncertainty. Given complex science, how do you move forward with policies that make sense? Communication between science and policymakers, and kind of all of these different topics. So it's been a wild ride. I've done a very deep dive into the literature on fire and vegetation and learned a lot. We have folks in this room who've presented to our group: Stephanie Landrigan, who you heard from earlier with Altadena Green, Dr. Travis Longcore, who will be on a panel later. In the coming weeks, we'll be hosting Dr. Ann Cope, the chief engineer of IBHS, on home hardening, and a number of other scientists, including Dr. Francisco Escobedo from U.S. Forest Service. But it's been wonderful to have this space where we bring together city staff, scientists, community leaders with their concerns, and kind of facilitating a meaningful dialogue that I think has had an impact regionally.
I love that. Invite 8 people, 120 come to the party. Good thing you had enough food. Okay, so next, I've been so honored to get a chance to work very closely with Meg Mullin, who is I always want to get your title just right, the faculty director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. This is the group that Alex referenced that helped to staff the Fire and Resilient Climate Blue Ribbon Commission that Lindsay Horvath asked to be formed, and was supported by the California Community Foundation. Megan had, I have to say, the team, and it was from a variety of different centers at UCLA, supported this 20-member Blue Ribbon Commission with incredible research in real time as we raced to provide actionable recommendations within 30 days and then within 90 days to the supervisor and to the community at large. So Megan, maybe talk a little bit about that process.
Sure, thank you. It's been just an extraordinary experience to work with the 20 volunteers who stepped up in the period after the fire to serve on this commission, including you, Cecilia, including at least one other I see in this room. I was scanning earlier. And some of whom had experienced devastating losses as a result of the fires, and brought really rich and diverse professional expertise to thinking about how can we recover resiliently, how can we rebuild in a resilient manner, and how can we think about protecting this region to a greater degree going forward from fire risk. And, oh, I see 2. And so we at UCLA, our role was twofold. One was to bring the research expertise, right, in this setting where Alex described earlier. Research is developing rapid fire. With each new event, we learn more. And with the development of new methodologies, new questions in spaces like vegetation and risk. And there are so many different methods and forms of evidence and forms and models that we might use to think about what are the protective elements of vegetation and what are the risk elements of vegetation, and how do those develop and evolve over time and across space. And so part of our role was to rapid fire, bring together the best experts we could bring together to answer questions that the commission developed, to offer memos and briefings, and just engage with individual commission members and working groups on a range of questions, right? From insurance to workforce safety to vegetation requirements to home hardening to ignition risks to utilities. So that was one part of what we did. And the other part of what we did is leverage UCLA's deep expertise in community engagement to think about how we bring local knowledge that's rooted in these particular communities, knowledge that's tied to the experiences those communities had with the fire's devastation, but also what the communities have been and might be in the future. And how do we leverage UCLA's expertise in engaging responsibly with communities at a moment when it's really hard to do that? People have experienced trauma, and the task of the commission was to act so quickly that is not consistent with best principles of community engagement practice, right? Is to dive in and work with folks without the opportunity to build relationships first. And so I have to say we were hesitant to take that on. And we did it, and what I learned through that was two things. One was the distrust that was rampant and continues to be rampant in the post-fire setting did not extend to UCLA. And there was a lot of confidence in UCLA as a partner when we started talking to people. The other thing I learned in that is, the leadership that we see arise in these communities is such a resource, right? And it's a resource not just for survivors themselves, right, who get representatives and advocates to help them navigate what they're experiencing, but also a resource for those of us who want to be able to help, to offer something, to be able to connect in a way that doesn't intrude too much. So that's what we did, and the product is that big fat report. There's some copies over there on the table. The first half of the report is the Commission's recommendations. The second half of the report summarizes what we learned, research gaps, where research really does help to guide us, and where the critical questions are not necessarily research questions, but questions about priorities and values. And we have sort of a second half of the report that summarizes those findings, as well as what we learned from communities.
Our last panelist is Liz Koslov, who's an assistant professor of urban planning and also with the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, who's an expert on managed retreat from a flood context, from a river context, from an ocean context, who's now delved into the issue of managed retreat around fire risk. And again, Liz, you kind of also stumbled into this, and suddenly your work amplified because of the fire. So please tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. And just thanks to everyone who's working to support this event. It's good to see you all here. So I moved to LA in 2018 for this job, and for 4 years, more than 4 years before that, I'd been spending time with people on Staten Island and New York who lost their homes in Hurricane Sandy, and following the experiences of hundreds of them who ultimately organized locally and decided they didn't want to rebuild, and they lobbied for money to get their homes bought out. They decided collectively that they wanted, in some cases, as they put it, to give their land back to Mother Nature. They didn't think it was safe there. They'd been very traumatized by repeated flooding, and for various reasons pushed for this, what's come to be called managed retreat. And this was very much the opposite of what I'd expected to find spending time in these places. As I'm sure all of you know, managed retreat is incredibly complex, incredibly controversial. It's extremely context specific. And so when I moved out here, it was shortly before the Woolsey fire, the Camp Fire. And as I was talking about my kind of Staten Island research around Los Angeles, people started asking me, well, how does this apply to debates over rebuilding after these catastrophic fires and thinking about retreat in the context of wildfire? And I said, I don't know. It's, even for different flood-affected communities, retreat holds very, very different meanings and politics and implications and consequences. It's, morally vexing all the way down. And so, but I was kind of curious. I thought, I want to understand more, because I had started talking with Catherine McConnell, who's a sociologist, a wildfire social scientist. She's at the University of British Columbia. She's from Boise, Idaho. And she spent a lot of time after the Camp Fire with people who, in many cases, actually moved to Boise, where she is from, and understanding their kind of residential migration routes and decision-making after fire. And people were asking her about this idea of managed retreat. And together, we noticed that there was just much more public discourse. There were people saying, we should retreat from fire. And we were very troubled by these statements and news headlines and so on, because there's actually essentially, very, very little empirical research studying these kinds of proposals and strategies in a wildfire context, let alone any kind of research that is, in conjunction with fire-affected communities and diverse fire-affected communities. And so we decided, the kind of project I'm here to talk about is in 2023, we got funding, I think it was around then, to convene a workshop of people to talk about the intersection of managed retreat and wildfire. And our goal with that workshop, going in is, we were not coming in with we were very agnostic about what came out of it. We really wanted to bring very different perspectives together in the same room and just talk about the complexity of this and raise some of the tensions, because we felt as though the discourse was very surface level and not accounting for people's lived experiences and diverse forms of expertise and so on. And so we had an organizing group that was made up of academics from different fields of expertise, practitioners, community members, and leaders. Ultimately convened a group of about 30 people with expertise ranging from, practitioners in state lands acquisition, urban and wildland firefighting, systems engineering, landscape architecture, insurance, disaster case management and post-disaster community organizing, and bringing together people from flood-affected communities and people who are experts in flood-based managed retreat with people who are experts in wildfire, who had different forms of experience relative to that. And at the time, we said, we're not trying to reach consensus here. We invited everybody here very intentionally because we expect you to disagree with each other. That is the kind of conversation we're trying to have, is to figure out what are the kinds of questions we should be asking, what kinds of research is needed, what is being, ignored when people are talking about this at present, and what do we really need to think about it before a policy managed retreat that was really developed in a flood context get sort of transported over to wildfire without thinking about the specificities involved. So that was the project, and happy to talk more about it, but excited for the discussion.
I love that you kept folks hanging. They have to stick around to find out what the conclusion was. Just a hack. Look up Liz and the New York Times opinion piece. So all of you have described situations where the knowledge that's being created is it's in in variety of aspects, right? Nothing's been settled in any of the things that you've talked about. There are research gaps, there's knowledge gaps. And in some cases, you've been thinking about this for some time, and then suddenly this comes to the fore. So there are certainly stuff around. Typically, we do peer-reviewed articles in academia, and it takes a while to get it done. And I'm thinking in particular, Kari, of your experience on the public health impacts. On the Blue Ribbon Commission, we had a member whose condominium that she had just purchased was still standing. And for most of the time that we were deliberating, she was trying to figure out, what is the safe label? Can I come back in? And there were no standards. There's no information. So the work you were doing in real time was highly relevant to a scientist. She herself is a scientist. So I want to ask each of you, and please, let's make it an open discussion. How does that uncertainty and that state of knowledge creation for different formats, how does that affect the way you engage in partnerships, particularly in an issue where you've got this fire that's happened, there's a lack of trust generally, for whatever wonderful reason there is trust in this institution or in the academic institutions. How do you manage that? And how do you deal with that? So please, open to anyone. I don't care if you want to take a shot at that.
Yeah, I'll take a shot. And I'm sure there are many people in the room who also have excellent questions, just like your colleague did on the Blue Ribbon Commission. First off, we wanted to hear from the community when we stood up our consortium. And we were really lucky that UCLA moved fast forward quickly. And I am so grateful for my UCLA colleagues because they established a community advisory board so that we could only ask a certain number of people in our circles, but we wanted to make sure that we could make a community that was across LA, all of the people that had been exposed to smoke, for example. So the community right away asked, what do I do with my home? What do I do with my dog? What do I do with the soil outside? What do I do for my children to go back to school? What do I do with these sheets? Do I get rid of them? And some of the questions were from people that had the resources to be able to follow through on any of our answers. But a lot of them came from communities and community members that didn't necessarily have the resources to evacuate quickly or to change and throw away a sofa. So this is why we wanted to make sure that when we got our science together, and a lot of science has been done on this, so we luckily were able to get, and again, it took 10 different universities to come together every week, answer these questions ourselves, and then put out data briefs every week or so to the community. So we had a website. We got it out there. But for some of the critical questions, we also didn't have answers. And we were very honest. We don't have answers to that. Those are excellent questions. We need to do more research on that before we get back to you. A lot of surfers asked, is it safe to go back into the water? We didn't have the answers, and I'm so glad that there'll be a panel on water after us. But these are the things that, for me, and as scientists, we are curious people. But we are very objective, and we try to be balanced, and in that, we also have to be humble that we don't know everything at that point in time, and that communities oftentimes can help us understand better. So when we had these conversations with communities, it was oftentimes bi-directional. What have you learned? What are you thinking about? How can we work together to best help answer those questions? But we've come a long way, and the LA Fire Health Study website now, if anyone's interested, we have a lot of actionable data briefs and actionable briefs that one can take and use individually as well as for their community. Thank you.
To that, how did, in this moment, how does this affect the design of the way you collaborate?
I just want to, for those of us who sit in UCLA bureaucracy day to day, there are at least 3 examples on this stage in which we could credibly say UCLA moved fast. I just want to say that. I'm going to actually kind of tackle this from a different approach. I was thinking as you spoke, Kari, I'm going to raise a thorny question around this, right? Which is, in, the post-fire context, there were a lot of ways that our work with the commission and your work could really respond to like immediate requests from individual members of the public, right? And people we would run into like needed quick GIS mapping because they had an entree into a state agency, and if they could just get a map to count the number of homes that might be impacted by some particular condition they were worried about, like we ran quick GIS maps. We arranged some introductions. We, responded to the individual surfer. Like we were able to do that, and at least in my experience, reaching out to 50 plus academics across the university, across the state, across the country, everyone was ready to drop everything and help. Like, I'm wiping out what I had planned to do today in order to respond to this request. I continue to get those requests, and I can't really do that now. And that's a thorny part of this space, is when can we do that, right? When can we have the privilege, many of us in this university, we have a lot of flexibility over our own schedules. And in moments in time, we kind of can just ignore a lot of what we do in order to dedicate our attention to something else. But we can't do that forever. The students keep showing up, and so it gets to a point where we can't continue to do that. And I actually think that's a real challenge when we think about partnership and what it looks like over the life cycle of these events.
Yeah,
Can
go ahead,
I
Nurit, please.
jump in on that? Yeah, I think so. I'm kind of a hybrid, right, with research and academia and more applied work. And so in my more applied work, I've been part of emergency management and operations here at UCLA, and then in, other contexts. And after an emergency, you do hear this from people like, wow, it was so amazing to be able to just cut through red tape, to be able to move quickly, to be able to work together in a way that we don't under ordinary circumstances. You hear this from operational folks who are busy, ordering supplies in response to an emergency, but also, in this context that you're speaking of organizing research. And so I think all of these efforts, even the city pulling together this amazing center with all the permitting people and everybody together, I think in all of those instances, it's worth thinking, okay, so maybe we can't do this exactly how we're doing it every day, but what lessons can we take with us? What of these collaborations, what of this nimbleness can we bring into our work, and how? And I think that's a very important question for all of us to take the time to make happen as we move out of the immediate emergency response phase into this longer term recovery work.
And Meg, and I'll bring you into this too, Liz. What you're describing is, I'm thinking of Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, right? Right after the emergency, right after the catastrophe, there's just amazing collaboration and alignment and people reordering their priorities, but that always has to dissipate at some point. And so what can we take from some of, as you noted, Nurit, some of these streamlining, some of the more efficient ways that we've done work, can't we import that and keep that permanent? Liz, want to bring you into this as well.
Yeah, so my work moves incredibly slowly, as anyone who has to review my promotion materials knows. As an ethnographer, I spend many years just having conversations, spending time doing interviews and field work, and trying to pick up on these longer term processes. And I think that's especially important after disaster, when there really is just a dearth of this longitudinal work following people's experiences over time. And we know, from mental health impacts, other types of impacts are not, they're not linear. And we see things, happening many years after the event. And so the workshop that we organized, happened a couple of months. We held it in October 2024, a couple months before the fires happened here. And for me, thinking of the work I do in this area as a multi-year project, a lot of it is about building those relationships and starting to just get to know people who are thinking about these things from different perspectives. And a big goal of our workshop was for people to get to know each other. And we said, we just want people across different geographies, different career stages, different forms of expertise to spend some time together. And whether or not you wind up working on retreat, I mean, that's probably not the thing you will necessarily focus on coming out of this, but we wanted many different forms of collaboration to emerge from that, whether or not they were connected to some set of shared research interests or not. And so, groups of people from that workshop, and I keep thinking of people whose expertise I didn't mention, we had people from like Forest Service, HUD, tribal forestry, all urban sociology, and philanthropy. Some groups of people who met at our workshop started to have a series of wildfire displacement dialogues led by the Climigration Network, which is a group that, a network of community leaders and researchers and practitioners thinking about community-led approaches to climate-linked relocation and displacement. And so the kind of work takes different forms and the expertise comes together in different ways. And I think part of what we can do is just create the space and the resources to bring people together so that they can be in touch when these disasters do happen.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thanks so much. And your comment really brought me to think about what Alex had mentioned, which is invest in alignment. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing we absolutely need to invest in is accountability. And with that, we are all accountable here because this is an iterative process. We're learning from each other, which is so critical. We have to have introspection, looking at what went wrong, what didn't go well, how can we learn from that? Because the next time there's a fire here, and there will be, unfortunately, and I'm so excited to be part of the UCLA Bruin community and living here, so I want to make sure that we understand how can we build resiliency the next time this happens. And so to me, with investing in alignment, looking at this collision feature, I love the way that Alex mentioned that new rubric to look at collision, alignment, as well as action. And what we did when we had this consortium, again, focusing on the community, we also expanded our knowledge by interacting with the LA County Public Health Department, the public health groups in California, the EPA, the Air Quality Management District. So as we moved along, and it wasn't always easy, we really wanted to make sure that we engaged with the right people, especially the government individuals as well, to have shared accountability. And in that, we need to look at what went right, what went wrong, and do better next time always, and think about how can we stand this up quickly at UCLA for the next time this happens.
Kari, thank you for bringing up the accountability issue because we've talked a little bit about how to engage with the community and all the challenges there and the careful work that each of you did in your respective projects. But this inevitably leads to the question about policymaking and advocacy and that sometimes uncomfortable role that you're called upon to advise a legislator on a piece of quick-moving legislation that's been gutted and amended to fix the problem. What do you think, Meg? Or something else that's going to make it really fast for people to rebuild. We're just going to hold all building standards because we want to make sure that it's affordable to rebuild, so we're not going to allow any new building standards for 6 years. Isn't that the right thing to do? So the question I have for each of you, because you've all probably been placed in this difficult position, is how do you take what you've learned and conclusions that you've reached and use that for wise advocacy in the heat of the moment while still retaining that credibility and integrity of the institution? Because that's ultimately what gives you that authority. So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. You can tell a story or not. Maybe you should use names. But tell me how you work with that, because it's a real issue. You're all well known, and so how have you dealt with that? Nobody wants to be. Just change the names. Yeah.
So the Blue Ribbon Commission, we will go back to that, right? I'll tell a story. So the Blue Ribbon Commission, its headline recommendation was the creation of a rebuilding authority, or potentially multiple authorities, that would have redevelopment agency-like powers in order to acquire land, finance rebuilding, coordinate contracting, serve as a magnet for external monies that might come in, whether it's philanthropic money or state money or federal money, and be able to coordinate the rebuild in the fire-affected areas. The commission saw this as tied to its resilience mission for two reasons. One was because a lot of resilience measures require coordination, right? They are community-level measures, or at least would become more affordable and easier to implement, even if they're household-level measures, if they were coordinated at a regional level. And the second reason was because they thought if people perceive resilience measures as slowing down the rebuild, we're going to see loss of support for resilience measures in a heartbeat. So we need an accountable governance mechanism that will deliver returns for people who are facing this challenge in order to maintain support for any kind of resilience measures we want to have in place. And that was in our conversations with community members. That was fairly well received. There was a lot of voice for a strong community hand in the design of that governing authority. And over time, as community members, as folks sort of engaged with it more and more, through, complicated politics that happened in Sacramento, but also because there were these sort of waves of trust and distrust that occurred in the months after the fires, that became a much more contested idea. And we don't now have a resilience authority. And I guess what I want to say is that there are a lot of folks who would point to like conspiracy theories, right, that brought it down and what have you. But I actually think it has to do a lot more with the cycle of recovery in communities and the way there's this tension between justifiable distrust, but also a recognition that there needs to be policy action, there needs to be a strong government hand. And for me, as a researcher and a person working in the space, it's actually pretty hard to know when the right policy intervention moment is, right? How do you honor those community voices while also having an eye on what I might think is the right thing for the future? Some of it is like, what's my responsibility as a university member around policy engagement, but also what's my responsibility in terms of the truth itself.
Right. Nurit, anybody else want to jump in on this?
Well, I'll give one example of a policy that we did use the emergency issue around fires in a very directed way, because this was really important. I was noticing that people were using their phones to be able to know whether or not to evacuate or not. And when I asked CAL FIRE, is that in a different language? How do you know that it's being read by someone who's Spanish speaking? It wasn't in Spanish. So that was such an easy ask to say, please put this in and translate it to other languages. So the Sacramento got on that right away. That was just an easy ask as a citizen, as a doctor, as a physician. I was noticing that, like Alex was mentioning, there were firefighters that were knocking door to door to tell people to evacuate. I also thought that that shouldn't be the case. You should be able to have better measuring, monitoring, and managing in that acute moment. So I think our alert systems need to be bettered. And then chronically, one thing that I have found has helped shape policy is data, is bringing science to the public, bring science to policymakers. And in that science, for example, in long-term safety around fires and smoke exposures, when people see that there's a 12-fold increase in stroke and heart attack of people over 65 years of age, just with 4 days of exposure of wildfire smoke, when people see that someone's asthma risk increases by 4-fold if they're 5 years and younger and exposed to at least 4 days of wildfire smoke, that type of data moves policymakers. So we were able to, for example, get free air filters for low to middle income families here in California, to have air filters there during a wildfire or not, during air pollution events, for example. So I think these types of acute issues can help. But chronically, For example, and David Eisenman might speak about this during his panel, UCLA is standing up a registry, and we need measurement over the long term of communities that have been exposed to wildfire smoke, to see the ebb and flow, the longitudinal nature of exposures of wildfire smoke. Does it increase my risk of cancer? Does it increase risk of premature births? This is where the LA community wants to see that data, and that's why I'm really glad that UCLA is standing up this registry, because I do think it will affect policymakers. And then lastly, I'll say that a lot of policymakers say, well, that adaptation technique, giving filters in people's homes, is that actually going to be too costly? What's the cost of that? And I think we do need to do more benefit cost analyses of these policies. For example, if you switch a diesel bus to an electric vehicle, you save about $270,000 per vehicle just in health benefits alone. So these are the types of communications that we also need to get upstream and work together to be able to reduce climate change, because I think we all admit that wildfires are increasing because of that. So these are mitigation techniques and policy that also help change.
Thank you.
So this question of sort of research and advocacy is it's an interesting one for, I think, a lot of scientists. You know, you see climate scientists getting to a breaking point and marching in the streets to say, the science is clear, take action. And, you know, I think it's always challenging for people whose role is kind of knowledge generation and questioning. Science is all about uncertainty. And, you know, I think within the climate change space, you saw a lot of challenges around climate communication, because you would have a pundit on stage with a scientist, and the scientist is always going to use language that is full of qualifications and uncertainty, and, well, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. But when the other side is, you know, speaking in clear terms. So
like a social media influencer, perhaps.
Exactly. So that question of how do you, as someone who is exploring complex issues, then communicate that to policymakers, I think is really an interesting and challenging one that a lot of people within universities wrestle with. For me, because I was not an individual fire research expert and rather a convener, which is another very important role of the university in bringing stakeholders together across sectors, my challenge with it was a little different, because I think individual faculty members within the university are expected to share their expertise and perspectives, and it's understood that that is their expertise and perspectives. Right. As part of the leadership of UCLA, there's a different pressure where if I speak, I can be seen as representing the whole university, and in this case, the whole UC system, because it was a state issue. So I had to be very careful in this working group to separate advocacy and education. And there was actually a separate coalition that formed that was really all about advocacy and strategies and legislative engagement and all of that. But because of that neutrality that I was really working hard to maintain, I think it created a different space where very diverse voices could be engaged. And we had, you know, retired fire chiefs and the former head of CAL FIRE, along with landscape architects and community leaders, the former mayor of Agoura Hills, who's here with us today, Penny Sylvester, and all of these different voices coming together in a very meaningful way. And what I decided for myself was what I can advocate for, and what we do all agree on in UC, is this need to connect science to policy. Right. So I didn't need to make my own statements. I could just share, here's what I'm hearing from this large, diverse group of stakeholders. And if I did any advocacy, it was, we really need to listen to science and to listen to diverse experts in this space in making decisions around policy, which I do very much believe in and feel I can get out there and advocate for strongly. So, but it's been a very interesting journey with balancing that. Yeah.
Liz, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think, you know, the university, there's certainly a role for just making sure that the policies that are put forward are grounded in evidence and evidence that's a good fit for that. And I think, you know, through my research, just seeing people that are closest to experiencing these problems, you know, have a very deep and holistic understanding of the ways that policy proposals will fall short potentially in certain ways, either have unintended consequences or have predictable consequences because they're playing out within unjust systems a lot of the time. And so, you know, a lot of the research I do focuses on what people are already doing and advocating for outside of formal policy processes. I think that's a huge part of it. But then, the university, I think, also has a role, again, to provide this space that is a bit outside of that for just broader social criticism and really thinking very deeply and asking all different kinds of questions that may be hard to ask with some of the urgencies of like the policymaking process and those timelines, and doing that in conjunction with a lot of different people coming at this from different places. After the fires hit here, when we were kind of so fresh coming out of that workshop, I started getting, I live in an apartment below Runyon Canyon, and so my family, we had to evacuate very suddenly for the Sunset Fire. And as we were, in gridlock trying to get out of there, I was getting all these texts from colleagues who will remain nameless, being like, I guess this shows we should just buy everybody out. Like, this couldn't show more clearly that, these places shouldn't rebuild, or there should be this retreat. And I feel like a lot of my advocacy type work, this piece, the guest essay that I wrote with Katie for the New York Times, come out of just being like very annoyed by something and wanting to kind of, as you say, like just be like, no, actually, like here's sort of the picture that I'm hearing from people, what the evidence is showing. And, in that case, talking about how, just to, use one example, and there's many more, but with flooding, you buy somewhere out, you create more permeable surface, more absorbent, floodable open space, and there's no funding generally in flood buyouts for like ongoing land stewardship or maintenance. The sense is, well, as long as there's not a building there, you've moved people out of the floodplain, you've reduced exposure, and it's going to create some kind of natural buffer. But you can imagine with fire, land, what effectively like results in land abandonment, or the growth of like a lot of unmanaged, unstewarded, unfunded like open space that could really dramatically increase wildfire risk and severity depending on how it happens. So just small things like that, and trying to advocate based on the experiences I've had, but in conjunction with what a lot of groups are already doing and pushing for in the context of sort of their everyday lives.
I appreciate that. Chaotic retreat versus managed retreat. All right, we're going to close this out. I do want to note one more thing. We were talking about the three elements that Alex outlined, the design for collision. We heard a lot about how each of these efforts designed intentionally, so we did have collision of lots of different voices and perspectives and research. Investing in alignment, we've talked a little bit about that here, particularly in investing in collaboration with agencies and others. The building for action part is very, very challenging. So I'm going to just leave you with, when I see Alyssa from Torch was here, a reason I wanted to call that out is because we can talk about the tree canopy, we can talk about whether it started the fire, it didn't start the fire was spread by the houses, not the trees. But we know for sure that more people die every year from excessive heat. That's the greatest threat we face. It's every single year. It's not just the summer, it's year-long in Southern California. And the canopy is critical, and rebuilding that habitat is essential. So that's the moderator's prerogative to give my speech. With that, let's give a warm thank you to this incredible panel. Thank you so much.